Welcome everyone. The vast majority of people throughout human history have believed in the existence of some higher being. Now, in contemporary times, that notion is being challenged. Although it's still held by a majority across the globe, it's still being called into question and indeed ridiculed by some. So Richard Dawkins, for example, calls it a delusion. Now, given that ours is a so-called age of information and knowledge, this presents us with a paradox. Has most of humanity, or most of history, been wrong? Does God exist? Can this even be proven rationally? And should it be? Should it have to be? And if it can, then what's the proof? And given any tenable proof, what are the implications of this on our everyday lives? So today's presentation, delivered by Uthman will attempt to answer these questions and remove the veil of emotion and rationality to discuss a question which has always occupied the inquisitive human mind. So I'll call upon Uthman to present his talk.
Well, thanks for that introduction. Assalamu alaikum to brothers and sisters, and a very hearty welcome to all our guests. As you can imagine, given that introduction, it's a very large topic we have to deal with here, and certainly an hour is not sufficient time. Given those limitations, I'm going to try and present as much as I can, with an eye also to leave some time for question and answer. I do want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions and answers. But if I do miss something, I expect to be picked up on it during the Q&A. Quick outline to begin with. I'm going to have an introduction in which I want to lay down some of the foundations of this discussion, some historical context on this topic. Then I'll look at some methods of thinking, which is very important given that we want to set the rational basis for this. And then we're going to move on to the discussion proper of the existence of God before we conclude briefly. Now, one of the questions that was raised by the chairperson was, well, is it even necessary? Is it even necessary? Is this even important? And I want to begin by arguing that yes, it is important. In fact, it is imperatively important. And that's from the angle that as human beings, as rational creatures, we act on the basis of rational assessment. We have the option to anyway. And most people would agree that that is the best way to act, on the basis of rationally assessing the realities in which we act. And so therefore, knowing the reality in which you are acting is fundamental. Right? And that applies in all spheres, anything. University, you graduate from school, you want to become join a certain field. Right? You want to become a doctor. Are you going to go to TAFE or university? Which one? Where? If you just act blindly, you're most likely not to end up where you want to go. You have to find out what steps am I going to take before you take them. And you can apply this really to anything. But when we look at the highest of levels, the holistic picture of life itself, then certainly the same principle applies. We need to understand the reality of life in order to act correctly in it. And of course, I want to propose, and I think hopefully something that won't be challenged, that we need to act in life on the basis of rational assessment, not emotion or imitation. Now, this topic, having said that it's important, it is often flippantly dismissed, right, with various notions. So it's not possible, for example. It's just a matter of faith. It's not necessary. There's so much evil in the world. Why would you even bother? Maybe he does exist, so what? as long as we're good people, does it matter? Right? Well, I want to say, yes, it does. Okay, and I will deal with these issues as I move along, each one of them, some explicitly, others implicitly, right? But I hope to answer all of these questions. Before I move on to the topic proper, I want to lay down some foundations, which I think are very important. The first one is that we need to frame the question properly. And I want to argue that the question is not, in origin, does God exist? Right? Because that question in itself, where does the idea of God come from? If you ask that question, you're presupposing something. Right? Otherwise, we're deciding. The original question for us is, what is the reality of the world in which we find ourselves? From that angle, because we want to act, we find ourselves in a certain context, right? We want to find what is the reality so that we can act on its basis and not in spite of it. Now, what do I mean by reality in this holistic sense? I mean, what was before life? What was before this world? What is to come after this world, if anything? And what is the relationship between this life, this world, and that which precedes it, and that which follows it, if there is anything? Right? That's at the most holistic level. And so questions such as, does God exist? Do we have a purpose in life? What are the origins of the world? Are sub-questions that branch out of that original question. And we must understand it like this. Otherwise, there's a problem in asking this question in a vacuum. Right, and of course, as I said, the original purpose here is that we act on the basis of our assessments. We act to the end of the purpose, and so we need to know the reality because it rests on this. So, I'll just put a sort of a very simple table here. Right, there's an assessment of the reality from which you can derive a purpose, and you act on that basis. Right, and the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that a different assessment will lead to a different purpose, will lead to different actions. So if someone were to assess reality and say, well, there's nothing before life and there's nothing after. We were born, we're going to die, go to dust, end of story. Right? What's your purpose in life then? Well, it could be, doesn't have to be. Each one of these can be different. To maximize your personal benefit. Make the most of it whilst you're here. Right? How are you going to act then? You're going to act on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. Anything that happens, what are my costs if I do this? What are my benefits? Weigh it up, go ahead. Alright? But if you believe that there was a creator before and there's accountability after, and that the purpose is to have success in the afterlife because that is the actual life in terms of being eternal and so forth, and again this can be different, then your act will be to act in line with the will of that creator. Right? And again, back to the first example, again, if the reality was nothing before, nothing after, you could also say, well, no, there is no purpose, and I can do whatever I want. Right? But the point here is not which one is right at this point. The point here is that the action depends on the purpose, depends on your assessment of the reality. That's the point.
The
Question
something
answer afterwards,
before
please.
life, something after. If you're asking not does God exist...
I'll take questions after, please, because otherwise we'll take too long. Yeah? Thank you. Right, so I want to argue then that in this context, the question of the existence of a creator, or otherwise, is one of the most important questions in absolute terms, because your entire life depends on it, intentionally or otherwise. But sometimes it may say, it doesn't matter this and that, you still made an assessment of the reality and you're still acting on its basis, even if you don't know. Even if someone says, I can do whatever I want, you've made an assessment, which is to say that there was nothing before, there's nothing after, I can do what I want. Right? And so we find then that the answers to these questions determine people's views. And so if I ask the question, what are your views on things like abortion or euthanasia or homosexuality or the death penalty or free speech or the blasphemy laws, etc., 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 inextricably the answers to this would be linked to how you assess the reality. And this is why this is a question of importance. Now, I think this is obvious, so I've still put it included in here that we need to move forward answering this question or any other on the basis of rational assessment and not emotion or imitation. By imitation I mean, I believe this because my father believed it, or Joe Blow believes in this, or everyone else does it, so I do it as well. And so obviously if we're going to adopt the rational approach, things need to be established on the basis of some sort of proof. Right, now here, I'm going to come also to thinking about methods of thought, and you may think, well, that's a bit abstract, how does that fit in? It fits in because saying that things need a proof is one thing, but talking about how you come to proofs is something else, and that's also very important. But give an example. If you didn't know what today's date was, and you needed to know because you had an appointment, right? You weren't sure. You saw a newspaper sitting on a desk that was nearby, so you picked it up and you looked at the date. That newspaper determines for you, that's the proof for you for today's date. Right? Now, that newspaper could have been yesterday's. You wouldn't know. The only thing you can determine is the date itself, but you're relying on the date. Right? So, at this point, you can either act on that date, or not act, or confirm, or otherwise. But just to holding everything was constant, that would be your proof. Your act will determine whether you need that proof to be certain or probable. Right? Because it could be yesterday's paper. But what will be the consequence of you getting the date wrong and missing your appointment? That will depend on whether you're going to make sure I'm going to go find out from some other means, or whether you're going to take it and move on. And that's an important point, because we do act in life a lot of times on the basis of less than certain evidence. Right? And in fact, as we'll come to see, a lot of scientifically established phenomena or facts are in fact not certain but probable. It's not a problem, but it has to be acknowledged. Also, what is belief? What is belief? Belief is the confirmation of a reality. Right? Confirmation. Meaning that if you say, I believe in the tooth fairy who lives on Pluto, it does not do that because you say so. That is either true or false. You are merely confirming. You're either saying, yes, it's the case, or no, it's not the case. Right? This is what belief is. And there's three ways to establish this. So I said imitation, emotion, and the intellect. And obviously other things like superstition and this and that come under one of these three. We agree we want to use the intellect. There are three ways you can use it, main ways. Again, there are branches. Rational thought, empirical or scientific thought, and logic. Right? And I'll come to these as well in due course, in terms of some brief details. Now, that's all right. Also, before moving on to the discussion itself, I want to level the playing field, as they say. What do I mean? There's a number of things we have to keep in mind, and a lot of times these things are missed and the discussion is had at cross purposes, right? Or there's wrong elements in the discussion. The onus of proof is on the one who makes a claim. Alright, if I say God exists, it's on me to prove it. But if you say something else, it's on you to prove that. Right? And the disapproval of a claim does not establish its opposite. If I say God exists and I give you my proof and you say, well, no, I don't agree with it, that does not prove for you that God, that whatever you're claiming exists, right? Or whatever you claim, right? You have to establish it separately. Certainly there may be some crossover in terms of what was used. And the standard of evidence should be equal on any one issue. What do I mean by this? I mean, if I present to you an elaborate proof that God exists, right, and you say, oh yeah, it's very, very nice, except that one part over there, that one premise, I'm not sure. Right? So for you, it's not certain. There's a question. Right? And so, if you are going to reject that on that basis of that question, yeah, then whatever proof you use to establish whatever you believe is a reality has to have the same standard. Certainty. Right? If you're going to apply the standard of certainty on whoever makes a positive claim, then you need to have the same standard on that issue. Right? But if your own proof for whatever is the case of the reality, nothing was there before. The universe has always been around. If it has any question marks, and that's fine for you, then it should also be okay for you that there are question marks in your mind on the proof that was presented, right? So standard of evidence needs to be equal on the same issue. We've already talked about certainty versus balance of probabilities, right? Because there's another point here. It could be the case that for you, neither is certain. You believe that the universe was always there, right? And I've presented this different idea to you. You've got questions here, you've got questions there. What do you do? As a rational person, it's a balance of probabilities. It's which one has less doubt, which one makes more sense, right? And there's no other way. It's irrational to say, doubt here, doubt there, I don't believe in it. You still believe in something. That's the point. You are still believing in something, and more often than not, you'll find, if you thought about it, you've had a very low standard of evidence for the belief that you've ended up adopting. Also, we should be careful at times not to reject particular conclusions because of the consequences it may have on our lives. Right? Because this question is, we say, logic posterior to the question we're speaking about. Right? Is the case X or Y? It has nothing to do with what X or Y will result in for you in your life. Right? Answer the question. If in the end you want to say it's X, but I want to still do this, that's your choice. Yeah? But you need to acknowledge that it is X, but I don't care, instead of saying, well, it's not X because that means this for me. Okay? I think that's also a very fair point. Okay, I'll leave that out. Alright, now I want to also have a quick look at some historical context on this question. As the chairperson mentioned, it is the fact that the vast majority of humanity throughout history have believed in the existence of a creator, albeit in different forms, in different ideas. Alright? And this is just to compare saying that there is a creator to saying, well, no, there's nothing. It's just the universe has always existed. Now, the classical Western argument for the existence of God, and I want to present this just to show that for the vast majority of history has been different to what we have today. Today, the sort of empirical scientific approach is to, as I said, flippantly dismiss this question. But classically, right, up until the Enlightenment, the classical Western argument has been an argument from causality. It's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And its first proponents were the Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. And it was refined by Christian theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and his contemporaries and others. Right? The Islamic classical argument, which also dates from the 7th century, from about the 8th century till about the 14th, 15th. After that, the Muslims have sort of stopped thinking, to be honest. But the classical Islamic argument has been an argument from temporality and contingency. Right? And we'll see what these mean. This is referred to generally as the Kalam cosmological argument. And some people claim that it's just a variation of the cosmological argument, hence the name. Now, having said that, some believers, when I say believers, I mean across the board, have held irrational positions. Right? And we have to accept this about reason. So, for example, Martin Luther said about reason that he is the devil's bride. Right? In fact, he used another word as well, which I'm not going to use because it's not appropriate. And Thomas Aquinas, the famous Christian theologian, he said that belief in Trinity must be based on faith alone. Even though he presented proofs for the existence of God, right? But faith in the Trinity must be based on faith. That's a religious position, yeah. But again, as far as we're concerned, this is untenable. Not because Trinity or Christianity, you can't have one standard for one thing and then say, well, this is going to ration up to here, but after that, we're going to skip and have faith, right? Because faith is the imitation of its emotion. It's got nothing to do in that sense of not being established. So therefore, I say this is untenable. Because how can you distinguish between right and wrong? Right? If you use faith in that meaning, that you come to me and say, look, have faith in this, have faith in Jesus, or have faith in Buddha, or whatever the case may be, and then you will see the truth. Why should I do this and not something else? How do I distinguish between right and wrong? I cannot do it on the basis of superstition or emotion or imitating others. And so things like the argument from scripture and argument from personal experience to prove God are untenable or weak at best. Right? Argument from scripture means God exists because the Bible says so, or God exists because the Quran says so. Right? And argument from personal experience is to say that you had something, you had some experience, right? Strong emotional feeling, and through it you felt something that either establishes God or otherwise, right? At this stage, I do want to mention that the Islamic experience historically has been very different to the European Christian one, and this is more relevant to what we'll come to in terms of the Enlightenment and what happened really post 16th, 17th century. But even before that, the majority position scholarly position in Islam has long been that belief must be established on reason, and not faith, not emotion or imitation or anything else. In fact, for those who have studied Islamic theology would know, we say in Arabic that taqleed is haram in the aqidah as opposed to in jurisprudence, in the creed. Right? Now, moving on in history, the Enlightenment period is very important in this discussion. And I'm talking about Europe, 17th, 18th century, a movement to liberate people from the influence of religion per se, but really specifically the influence of the church, right, which had over the years become oppressive, backward in terms of social, economic and scientific progress, intolerant to social inquiry, and we know all the examples of Galileo and Copernicus and whatnot. And so the Enlightenment philosophers came out and they said, look, enough is enough, this is ridiculous, right? God, what God? Prove to us God exists, use your reason, scientific inquiry, etc., etc., right? And so they said that reason was the most central human faculty which must be exercised through scientific endeavour. Alright? And they sought to challenge dogmatic ideas of the church and the political establishment, and we had a bit of a struggle, right? Most of it was intellectual, there was also otherwise as well, but the conclusion was the triumph of secularism. The triumph of secularism. Alright, this is important because prior to this, really secularism was never established in the West, let alone anywhere else. And why is it important? Because moving on from there now, the whole world adopts this idea. Whole world in terms of states anyway, right? And obviously a lot of people on the ground as well. And so when we look at this Western experience, we sort of got the Greek philosophers going on to the Christians, who some of them are saying, well, faith can, we can base things on faith, it doesn't have to be all reason. And then you got the Enlightenment, where people are saying, no, look, this idea of God, what are you talking about? Okay, if you want to believe in it, you can, but no influence, religion should not have influence in the public sphere. We've come up, this has contributed to this flippant attitude towards these issues. Right? So we have this understanding that belief is in stark contrast to reason, that science is superior to religion, that science and religion, there's a clash. Right? And a lot of this really goes down to the way you understand these words. Okay? And we'll get to that, but it's a proposition that this is an assumed clash. Really, the clash does not exist. And if you look at other than the Christian experience in Europe, you'll find that it's vastly different. And another point that doesn't establish anything in and of its own, right? I accept that, but it's a very interesting point that the best scientists, some of the best scientists of modern and pre-modern ages, not pre-modern, but in the last few centuries, believed in the existence of a creator. People like Albert Einstein, people like Isaac Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, and there's many others, right? So this assumed clash certainly needs further thought. At this point, however, all I want to say is that this historical baggage needs to be discarded at the doorstep of this discussion. Right? It doesn't help in any of this. Now, I want to have a quick look at some methods of thought. And this is very important because, again, it comes to the core of the issue of this science versus religion idea, right? Because there's three main methods of thinking: scientific or empirical, logic and rational. Right? And so I want to stop for a bit on this scientific empirical method. It was a result of the Enlightenment in Europe, right? And we already mentioned it. The scientific method to say we're going to use reason, we're going to use through scientific endeavour establish whatever you want to establish, right? The reality of things. Now, on the surface then, the determination to use reason can't be faulted. It's a very good thing, right? However, the problem arises in that this trend went a bit further. And then you had very sort of weak ideological origins. And that it did not understand where its limits are. Right? These are the points. And so the empiricist trend went further. Anything that claimed to be certain had to be questioned and confronted through scientific inquiry. Through the empirical method. Right? What is the empirical method? We'll come and have a look at that. But there's a good quote from Russell Bertrand, one of the Enlightenment philosophers, who said, to teach how to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation is perhaps the chief thing that philosophy in our age can do for those who study it. So there's a dismissal of certainty. Nothing can be certain, right? We're starting on this premise, nothing can be certain. If it's not certain, that means there's hesitation. But at the same time, if we were hesitant about things, what can we do? Right? So there has to be some balance. That's what they said. Right? Certainly, we disagree with that. Things can be certain. Now, the ideological origins of these ideas are important because they illustrate, right, some of the flaws in the thinking. The initial question that arose in terms of empiricism and the other schools of thought that challenged it was, does thought originate before matter or does matter originate before thought? Right, matter meaning things. Just to simplify for now. It's not a philosophy class. Right? The rationalists said humans have been born with innate thoughts. Thoughts come before matter. Right? You've got the thoughts, you see matter, you take into account this information and you make a judgment. The empiricists said, no, how can you say that? How can you make a judgment on before matter there was thought? Were you there? Do you know? Have you got any tangible proof? No, you don't. Therefore, thought results from matter itself. Right? Thought is a reflection of matter on the brain. When you come into contact with something, sense perception, information goes to your brain, that's thought. Alright? And you have judgments. And so empiricism is knowledge acquired by primary contact with the external environment. And then acquiring that information and synthesizing it and whatnot. Right? And this is where the problems arise, yeah? This is just to understand what they said. The problems arise because this implies that you cannot have thought. If a reality does not exist, you can have a thought about that. Because thought is a reflection of matter. If a certain matter doesn't exist, you cannot have a thought about that matter whatsoever. Alright? Now what are the problems with that? Number one, this is an incorrect conception of the way human beings think. Right? Why? Because thought requires, amongst other things which we look at, there's a necessity of having previous information about the thing that you were sensing to have any judgment on it. Right? And very simple examples can prove this case. If I give to you a book in Arabic and you've never studied Arabic, you don't know Arabic, you can look at it all day and feel it all day and smell the book if you want, but you're not going to have any thought, judgment on this. What does it say? What does it mean? You need to have previous information. Right? And there's many other examples that can be given to prove this. Further, the scientific method, as we will see, begins with a hypothesis. Right? How can you come up with a hypothesis before having tested anything? Right? Now obviously now we can because we have previous experiments, but the question is essentially one of where did the first hypothesis for the first empirical experiment come from? Right? It's a question. The result of this empirical approach is to say God cannot be sensed, therefore God does not exist. Right? It's one approach to say God does not exist. But that question itself defeats the idea, because if God does not exist, if you cannot sense Him, where do you get a thought about God from? Where did any human being that you can say, I heard these fanatical religious people talk about it, where did they get it from? If He doesn't exist, right? If this reality does not exist, on whose mind did that matter reflect for the thought to arise? Right? Even the thought of negation can't arise if there's no reflection. Now, the scientific model, all of us should know this. If you've been to school, Year 9, there's boring textbooks that we all read. What is the scientific model? Hypothesis, design, testing, observation, recording, conclusion, evaluation. Right? And obviously the terminology differs from place to place around the world, but this is in essence the scientific model, which is the basis of the empirical method and empirical thinking. Right? What are the issues? Subjectivity cannot be eliminated because of the way you state your hypothesis, right? But even those who propose this method don't deny this fact, right? So that's not really a problem. The results are speculative. There's always an error probability of error. Again, this is an accepted fact. The more important fact, the more important aspect here is that to apply this method, in the first instance, you have to be able to identify a variable, isolate it, subject it to new conditions, manipulate it, and observe it. If you can't do that, the method doesn't apply. Very simple. Alright? And so, a variable, something, some tangible thing which can be sensed, and sensed either by any of the 5 senses, has to be identified, isolated, manipulated, and observed, meaning all 4 things. Anyone missing, you can't apply it. If there's no identification, you have nothing to test. If you can't isolate the variables, you don't know what the results of the testing are a consequence of. If you cannot manipulate, there's no experiment. If you can't observe, there's no conclusion that you can draw. Right? So the sum of this is, if you cannot sense something, things that cannot be sensed, the empirical method cannot apply. It does not apply. Okay? And therefore, quite clearly, the scientific method is not capable of answering every query. It does not apply in many areas. Right? For example, sport. Was Mike Tyson a better boxer or Muhammad Ali? I think it's an easy one, but anyway. Literature. Which works rate higher, Shakespeare's Hamlet or Dickens' Hard Times? Right? Politics. Was Thatcher a more successful Prime Minister or Tony Blair? Life. Why do we exist? Right? And this is an important point, because science really answers questions of how, not why. You can't answer questions of why. History. Was Muslim Spain the most tolerant place on earth during the 13th century? What are you going to sense? You can't sense anything. What variable are you going to take out and isolate and manipulate? You can't do it. Right? And just to get back to the point about the origins of life, even scientifically, the earliest available knowledge we have, the data we have to work with, is from about Planck seconds. It's from about 1 times 10 to the minus 34. That means 0.340 seconds after the Big Bang. And this is according to the most up-to-date scientific theories. For anything before that, there's no data. There's no data, therefore you can't apply the scientific model to answer the question, what are the origins of life? Right? And that's the point. Another point that's really made sometimes is that the scientific thinking is the most evolved form of thought. And we've already sort of disproved that from one perspective, but from another angle, the question really does arise, if you believe this, that what kind of thought process did human beings utilize before the Enlightenment? Right? Were the likes of Copernicus and Avicenna and Euclid, Zeno, Aristotle, were all these people primitive thinkers who came up with brilliant theories at their time? Right? Like Copernicus with his heliocentric theory, and Aristotle and Plato with a lot of their philosophy. Were they all primitive thinkers? Because they didn't have the scientific model to think with. And so the sum of this is to say that this is not bagging out science. Not at all. It's just saying that the scientific model provides us with a very important framework necessary to deal with matters it is useful for, where it applies. However, it has definite limitations, and in areas that you cannot sense something, it does not apply. It cannot apply. Now, another way of thinking is logic, but I want to skip this because we don't have time. Really, the summary of this is, it's a good way, but it has some limitations. It applies in certain areas, and the limitation with logic, classical logic, is that it's built on premises which may or may not be built on sense perception. And so the validity of a syllogism depends on its structure, but the soundness depends on the soundness of the premises. Right? The important part is that the rational method is the method that we need to adopt. This is really the way human beings think, and we need to understand it so that we can think properly. Right? What is the rational method? The rational method is the transfer of a sensed reality to the mind for judgment on the basis of previous information. Right? The last part is very crucial. And so the core elements are sensation, same mind, reality, previous information, and judgment. Any one of these is missing, the thought will not go ahead. Right? Go ahead means you won't come up with the correct judgment. And this is the method that's the basis of all thought. Others, like the scientific model and the logic and so forth, are types. And that's the point. They're types of this thought. They apply in some areas, and others they won't apply. And rational thought, therefore, can lead to certain knowledge if, in those areas, we meet certain conditions. Okay? And not only that, it can go further as well. Now, quickly to actually talk about the topic itself. Right, but now, all that before that is very important. I want to present quickly, actually what I'll do is I'm going to leave, I'll go the classical Islamic argument for the existence of God, right? But I'm going to leave that out. It's slightly a bit complex and I don't have time there. I'm going to go to the simpler refined version because that's really what matters. And then we'll move on to some counter arguments. But really the Kalam argument is one from temporality, which just says that the world has a beginning because its component parts are temporal, therefore the whole is temporal, therefore it has a beginning. Right? If it has a beginning, then it has a beginner by the principle of determination. Because before it existed, there was two possibilities, that it come into existence or it doesn't come into existence. And these two possibilities in and of themselves, there's no difference. They're the same, right? So for one to prevail, there has to be a determinant. And there's an argument also from contingency, right? But we can leave this out. I want to talk about what I call the simpler refined argument. That doesn't mean anything. This is a summary of it, right? And then I'm going to go to some details. Everything we perceive, this is important, this point that we perceive, because even the rational method only applies on that which you can sense. Everything we sense in the universe is limited and finite. Everything that is limited and finite is dependent. The universe is the sum of limited finite things and is therefore limited and dependent. Right? Because an infinite regression cannot exist, then everything ultimately depends upon an independent, unlimited being who created or originated everything. That's the summary, right? Now let's see why that's the case. When we look around ourselves, sense everything that is out there, two conclusions on this topic we can note. Number one, you can't sense a creator. Right? See, touch, smell, there's nothing there. There's no signals. Two, everything we can sense is dependent on something else or has a limit of some kind. Now, I'm going to come back to the second point, that's the important one. But some people want to stop the discussion on the first point. You can't, as I said before, you can't sense it doesn't exist. Seeing is believing. Right? Well, it's not. Right? Why? Because in origin, sensing a thing is not a prerequisite to prove its existence. Right? Sensing a thing is necessary for you to start a thought process, but it's not necessary to prove its existence. Very simple examples, your mind. Right? You cannot sense the mind, not the brain, but the mind. The intellect of the human being, you can't sense it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, hopefully. Alright? China. Right? Let's assume that none of us here had ever been to China. Right? Okay, you've just come back. It's an assumption. I'm assuming. None of us have been to China. You haven't sensed it. Does it exist? Right? You may not know. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but. Right? Your great-grandfather. You can't sense anything. Hopefully. Right? Assuming he's passed away. And so, especially if you go further, great, there's no way you can apply that. Doesn't mean it didn't exist. Right? That's the point. And so the point is, if the effects of a thing, can be proven, so too can its existence. And that's what's relevant here. And hence the proof of a creator is in the evidence of creation, if we find it. Right? And it's the second point that proves that, yes, we do. Everything, as I said, is limited and dependent, everything we can sense. What does that mean? Limited means it's finite, since its restrictions are inherent and unavoidable. Right? Restrictions of size and time and space and place, etc. Dimensions. And dependent means it depends on something else, either to bring it into existence or to maintain its existence. Right? And we can think about anything that will fit under these things. Right? So atoms, at the very smallest level, or if you want to start something bigger, the tree. The tree depends on the sun. Right? It depends on water. Human beings depend on food. Right? Human beings are limited in size. The tree is limited in size, in colour, in form, in shape, etc. That's what I meant. But even more sort of detailed things like atoms require space within which they exist. Humans cannot fly, see into the future, or escape death. Space, the entire universe, consists of limited things such as atoms and planets and stars, as big as they may be. Right? But the sum of limited things is itself limited. Things like heat are measured, quantifiable. Sound, mechanical wave, it travels through a medium. Light is also a wave. It doesn't have to travel through a medium, but it has definable properties like intensity and polarization and frequency. So everything you can sense is limited and is therefore dependent. Right? Why does that matter? Right? What does that imply? If that's the case, there's only four possibilities in terms of the origins of all these things. Right? Only four mutually exclusive possibilities. Number one, that the universe, which is the sum of all these things, has existed for an infinite length of time despite their existence of these things. Right? So everything's just always been there. Limited things brought other limited things into existence, and so on. Limited things all depend on each other in a cyclical chain of mutual dependencies. Right? Or number four, limited things were brought into existence by an unlimited cause, or an unlimited determinant. Here I don't mean cause in the cause-effect sense. Right? Now obviously the last option is the one that proves the existence of creator. The other three disprove it. Right? And so what I move on to do is to show that 1, 2 and 3 are incorrect. And the incorrect, understanding the impossibility of what we call an infinite regression is the key to understanding why they are incorrect. Right? Infinite regression is like this here. It's to say that A depends on B, depends on C, depends on D, depends on E forever. Right? Depends either to come into existence or to maintain its existence. Right? Now, if this regression is true, then this means the entire thing has always existed. Right? Because otherwise you won't get A at all. Now, okay, I'm going to make this better. Let's just actually show you away from A's and B's, show a real life example of dependency, right? The computer here depends on electricity, right? Which depends on the power station, which depends on a magnet, which has a metal core which turns, which requires turbines for it to turn. The turbines require steam, the steam requires water. The water boils using heat, the heat comes from burning coal. The coal decayed it's the decay of wood and other stuff under pressure for millions of years. That process required sunlight and photosynthesis, and we keep going. And really the only thing that would limit us in doing this is our collective knowledge of science, or how far we buy into these things. Right? And at each point I can start another chain and go somewhere else. Because the computer does not only require electricity, and the electricity does not only require the power station. But the point here is that this question about does this go on forever? Right? Does this go? That would be an infinite regression. And to answer that question, the answer to the question is no. Right? If it goes on forever, the computer does not work. Because if the last thing, if you keep going, you have to stop somewhere for the thing before it to work, for the thing to come back to the start. Right? And so, understand this also requires us to talk a little about the concept of infinity. Right? And to distinguish, importantly, between the possible infinite, which is an idea, and the actual infinite, which does not exist in the reality which we can sense. Right? What do I mean by an idea? An idea you would have done it in maths. Right? The hyperbole. The graph, fx, y equals 1 over x. This line goes towards this asymptote, this axis. It keeps going but doesn't touch. It's going to keep going forever but it's not going to touch. Right? It's an idea. It's used in maths for certain principles. It does not exist in the real world. It cannot exist in the real world. Alright? And really, even most prominent mathematicians of our time have denied this existence. We have George Cantor, a 19th century mathematician, and he's got the Cantor paradox. Right? And David Hilbert, 20th century, he says, for example, that the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. Right? And Kastner and Newman, also contemporary mathematicians, they write that the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Right? Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from existence of objects in the physical world. Right? So this is the point. Infinity does not exist in the real world. It only can exist outside of the limited, finite world which we can sense. And we can put it another way, simple maths, that the funny sign there is infinity. Infinity minus 1 has to be infinity because you can't increase or decrease. Subtract infinity from both sides. Right? What do we get? Minus 1 equals 0. Which it doesn't, obviously. Right? It's just an idea. And so to illustrate this another way, and a much more clear way, if the universe has always existed, right, that means it's existed for an infinite length of time. Right? Now, the concept of time itself is disputed. What is time? Right? But for a very simple definition that people generally agree with, time is it's a measurement of a chain of events. One thing happens, another thing happens, another thing happens. Right? But if we say the universe has always existed, we're talking about an endless chain of events. An endless chain of events. Right? And if the universe has always existed, that's really saying it's always existed till this point in time. Right? Till this point. Right? And so, in other words, we're saying eternity has passed up to this moment, and we are currently at the end of an endless chain of events. Right? It doesn't work. And again, there's many good examples. Aquinas has his traversal of the infinite. But to bring it down to reality for ourselves, right? Very simple example that I like to use. Before you came in here, you're probably outside some other building or having lunch or something, right? Before that, you woke up in the morning. Before that, your parents got married, or maybe, I don't know, I'm assuming they were married, and you were born, and before that, right? You see 10 of events. But the point is, if there is no beginning, right? And anywhere, if your parents don't come together, you're not born, right? If there's no beginning, the second thing doesn't happen, the third thing doesn't happen, the end does not exist. Therefore, if the end exists, as it does, we're here, I'm talking to you, right? You're listening to me. Therefore, there's a beginning. Okay? And so because infinity, all these conclusions are absurd and impossible, the infinite relation does not exist, therefore, there is a beginning. And that also rules out the other thing. Now, sometimes the other sort of approach is said, well, look, maybe it doesn't have to be A, B in a straight line. Why can't it be a cyclical dependency? Like, for example, the water cycle, where the water depends on clouds from which it comes. The clouds depend on evaporation of water itself. So if you've got water, rain, clouds, going around like that. Right? Why can't we have a closed circle? Well, the reason you can't have a closed circle is because even in a cyclical dependency, right, there has to be something to initiate the cycle. Right? Why is that the case? Otherwise, we fall into what the philosophers call circularity. Right? What does that mean? If two possible things are the cause of each other, each would precede the other and consequently itself. Right? If A depends on B, but B depends on A, that means A depends on itself. I mean, A has to be there before it's there for it to be there. Therefore, if you have this, nothing exists. Unless there's something from external to this chain which initiates them together. Right? Because A can't exist without the cause, can't exist without the effect in this sense. And so, if it's circular, nothing exists. So therefore, because something exists, it cannot be circular. Now, I'm running out of time here. Okay, very quickly, even if we look at the science perspective, a lot of prominent, reputable scientists of the modern age accept that the universe had a beginning. Alright? I had many quotes here, but I'm not going to go through them. I want to sort of just move quickly on to some counter-arguments. Alright? So, really, the main counter-argument is the materialist or the empirical claim, which is to say that it is an infinite succession of changeable and dependable beings produced one after another in an endless chain. And really, we've already disproven that. But some other points about this are very pertinent. One is that this does not answer the question. This is to evade the question, right? Because it doesn't account for the origin of the universe, which is the original question: what is the reality of the life in which we live? And Samuel Clarke, the English philosopher, notes this. And William Wollstone, another English philosopher, he gives a real good example of this, right? Saying, imagine there's a chain hanging from one of the heavens, one of the skies. But we don't know which sky it's hanging down from. We don't know how high it's hanging. And it's got the locks of the chain. Right? If we ask what supports this chain, right, would it be enough for me to say that this part of the chain, the lowest link is held up by the one above it, and the one above it is held up by the one above it, and so on forever? Is that a sufficient answer? Right? And clearly it's not. Right? Because you're not answering what supports the chain. Right? It's absurd for you to say that a finite chain needs support, but when the chain becomes infinite, it doesn't need support anymore. It just keeps going. Right? And so the materialist claim is to not answer the question, is to evade the question. What other counter-arguments do we have? Sometimes people sort of they don't really understand sort of the depth of the argument, but they sort of say things like evolution or science proves that the beginnings was otherwise. A lot of things that science has proven, like evolution, is how life has got to where it is now from a certain time after the beginning, or from what they imagine to be the beginning, like the Big Bang. Right? It says nothing about what was before that. So saying, for example, that inanimate matter changed to organic molecules and to this and to this and then to this, just doesn't answer the question. Right? Where did the initial inanimate matter come from? And same thing with evolution. And again, that's not to say that evolution is wrong. Right? The Islamic position is some parts are okay, some are not, but that's a different question altogether. Now, I also had something about Richard Dawkins, but again, there's some of Richard Dawkins sort of rebuttals are that a lot of it's emotional rhetoric, playing on the ignorance of the readership, right? Like things like to say, for example, that he puts the best of science against the worst of religion to come to an obvious conclusion. Saying things like people have done horrible things in the name of religion, and they have. Right? I don't dispute that, but what's that got to do with the existence of God? People have done horrible things in the name of secularism, yeah, and in the name of science. A very example which Sheikh Hamza Yusuf gave was in the 20s. There's many examples. In the 20s, America, science said that poor people are unfit for breeding, therefore they should be sterilized. Right? Now, that doesn't the point is not whether about this. The point is that doesn't disprove that science is wrong or science doesn't exist. Right? Or secularism doesn't exist. It exists. The question of the characteristics of a thing or its attributes is posterior, external, after to the question of does it exist. You can't start talking about the characteristics before having first established does it exist or not. Right? And also obviously wars and history and the rest of it. However, he does make some worthy points, which I want to have a look at. He says, he words this differently, but I've put it in plain English. He says, for example, if there is a sole cause for the universe, then who created the sole cause? If there is a sole cause, what evidence is there to say what its essence or characteristics are? Meaning, okay, maybe there is an unlimited, independent being. How does that make that God? Right? How does it make this omniscient, omnipresent being which the Christians and Muslims are speaking about? Right? And he says that it has been proven mathematically that the infinite can exist. And we've already dealt with some of these points, but again, a very quick response. The point is not, I didn't start off on the basis of saying that all effects have a cause and the rest of it. Right? The point is, we find a certain reality for it. Rational necessity dictates that the fact that we exist requires a beginning. Right? And so this is what takes the first cause, if you want to call it that, outside the realm. Right? It has to be unlimited and infinite, otherwise it's within the chain and the chain goes back again. We're back into the infinite aggression. Right? The point about how does this mean it's God is a valid point, it's a very good point. And I say clearly it doesn't. Alright? We prove that this being, that doesn't prove anything about its attributes other than what the proof points to, that it's infinite and unlimited. To say that all-knowing and so forth has to come from elsewhere. And the third point, we've already dealt with it. I want to stop there. I had some other things, but I want to keep a couple of questions in. I just had some contradictions of the claim. Right, and anyway, I'll leave it there. We're running on 5 minutes. I think we don't have my should we ask a question because we're running out of time? If anyone wants the email or the email of the society here, we can give that and we can come back later.
Go to the store. There's a store.
There's a store as well, so you can come and ask questions. I'll be here.